Hello, everybody. Oh.
I'm definitely not sure
Type. Okay, I will tell a little bit about context why I'm here. Actually, I was invited by Lokomotiva and Slobodne Veze to make kind of semi-artistic, semi-critical research of the art scene here in Macedonia. Because I was dealing with these issues in a local context of Serbia mostly, partly in Montenegro. And I spent here 10 days, what is a really kind of limited period for such an ambitious plan. And actually the result which I have after, that I actually coming out now with after 10 days, is it is really restricted somehow, not only by the short period, but it is also the projection of my position in general about these things, and also it is something that is in a process. It is not finished actually yet. And actually, I'll try to extract some symptoms of the scene that I find crucial for the development of the scene at the moment in Macedonia. And what I found the most important when I came here is this relation between state institution and independent art or cultural institution, because this is really something that is part of the processes that are going on in all the region. This interfering state institution and independent institutions. And I find these relations very problematic in a many sense. And I'll try to say firstly about this notion of independency in a cultural sphere in general, what is also provocative issue, especially if you would really like to understand what is going on at the moment, we need to a little bit go in the past to understand how cultural scene is actually or was organized in the past according to this issue, state or independent of the state. And what does it actually mean at all? Because here it is very much used, this word independent, everything is a kind of independent. And to go in the past, we need to say that in the beginning of socialism, the idea of socialism was formed about something that is called kind of social good. But that idea in socialistic Yugoslavia was rejected at the very beginning, maybe from the 60s, when Yugoslavia opened itself for a more market-oriented economy. From the 60s onward, and that the regulation of economy was firstly considered only service and retail trade areas, but not health system, culture, education, and this system, they were still part of the state-controlled system. And I think with the culture, it's a really also provoking issue, because in socialism at 1974, the culture started being organized via SEAS. It means self-managed interest communities. That means that actually these organizations of culture could organize free exchange of work among workers in its own field. So that means that cultural field was not totally dependent of the state, nor totally independent of the state. And it is really, from the beginning, we could say this is a kind of unclear, actually, how much state is controlling, and I think it's very much related about what Anna was mentioning yesterday. She came out with the idea that total field of culture was kind of controlled with the state, from the state and so on. What is, I wouldn't say this is totally true, but this ambivalent economic policy, let's say, led to the kind of strange actually result because it happened, for example, that some university professor were getting a smaller amount of money than some, for example, taxi driver or so on, because free market, because taxi driver were operating through free market mechanisms, and the professor was in some very controlled. I mean, control from an economical point of view in the controlled area. So this is kind of injustice that cultural workers somehow felt in the socialistic system, and I think this is kind of important because much later, during the 90s, when independent cultural cities were organized on a much higher scale, actually these highly educated workers, we actually the one who were the main agitators for the changing of the system, because they were not fighting only for a free speech and so on. They were also fighting for a deregulation of its own field from the point of economy. And what is really important, they will actually require for the system in which they value will be recognized. And this is actually at the end always free market economy actually. And in the idea of independent culture in Macedonia from 2000 onward had been based on this separation of culture from the official culture that exists under the auspice of the state and the dominant party. And in the beginning of the 2000s, there was a huge EU optimism here with the Social Democrats in power and so on. But 2006, when Gruevski came in power as a kind of really dominant and kind of oppressive party, a lot of cultural organizations start to be organized as a kind of independent. So these activists were starting to organizing themselves in kind of more organized form. That are now registered as NGOs or associations and so on. So, so actually this group started the process of self-institutionalization, which pledged for a stateless policy, thus creating the spaces in which they would have the opportunity to show themselves. For example, since 2001, most of these most important art organizations now that are existing in Skopje are formed like Kontrapuk, Lokomotiva, Press to Exit, FRU, Budan Theater, and so on. There is a huge number of these associations, which in some moment started to organize themselves under in a kind of association of independent art scene, and this association is called Jadro. But of course, and Jadro consists of, I think, 83 or something organization, but then there is a kind of switch that happened. Actually, some organizations go out, some in, and actually this is a process that, actually it was a process where they start to be organized actually. And this is really kind of interesting because from some point we have a kind of a system of independent organizations that are kind of staying for the stateless policy, to be kind of separated from the state, out of the state, and then at once we have a fight to be kind of recognized as an institution. An institution is always kind of, I mean, institution traditional, from the traditional perspective of this idea is always based on a kind of preserving of the present system, actually, and to be recognized by the state as an institution, this was one of the most important goals that Jadro actually brought out, actually, and of course, Jadro was organized according to few goals. Actually, one goal was to find a place to work for all these independent association and organization. The other one was lobbying for actually cultural workers. And what I actually mentioned yesterday, this is one of the symptoms also that I would like to tell about, that actually the idea of this organization was to make the status of cultural worker actually better. And as I mentioned yesterday, this was a kind of result of this next step that came after the processes of privatization and the new neoliberal turn actually that happened. The first one was with the privatization that came in the factories and industrial sector, and a lot of workers there without jobs, and they actually, this lower classes become even lower, and then with the next neoliberal step we have an attack on the middle class, and cultural workers are staying in that line actually, and when they start being actually attacked and their position was kind of becoming insecure, they start organizing themselves and fight for their own status. So what is kind of also symptomatic for the scene is that all the cultural initiatives like these that are gathered together around the Association of Independent Scene, or more left-oriented like Solidarnost or Dunja or something like this is a totally lack of the working class people at all. I mean, for example, even the left organization, they actually do not have the project that are really dealing with the working class people or representing working class people at all. They are just politicizing these issues and so on, but actually they are all kind of middle class cultural activists. And and in Macedonia, actually we could say that there is no independency as such, because also being an individual artist, you are not independent from the system. If you would like to be registered as an artist, you need to organize your activity in one kind of legal form. That means that you are kind of small business entrepreneurs. You need to form the company and so on, to pay the taxes, to be registered and enter into this system. And it is very difficult to enter in this system, but it's also very difficult to go out because closing the company is very difficult. I mean, it's you need to pass through all the procedures, you need to have someone who will lead your papers and so on. So everything is very much structured by the system to put you into that organized system of work, which would be under the state, under the control of the state. And of course, this is a kind of simplification when I'm talking about Jadro, because independent organization, this Jadro as a kind of association consists on a lot of these organizations that are very different, and this binary division exists only in principle that the Jadro platform incorporates in itself many transitional forms of organization, such as those that are based on the ideas of bohemian entrepreneurships, or some cultural activists that recognize that the ideas of NGO entrepreneurship in culture could today fact as a safer and more profitable way to go on than to be just led by uncertainty of the market, competition or employment in the state institution. Also, that is also very much rejected, especially because after such a huge dominance of the one party in the state institutions, it become very, how to say, unacceptable to take a position in the state institution, because it is very much, it is considered as a kind of dirty position, because it is clear that if you take that position, you need to do a lot of compromises to somehow fit into the system. You are actually not independent at all. And but what is interesting, when all these associations are gathering together, the stronger one become the one that are more commercial somehow, that are more based on the idea of creative entrepreneurships and such things, because they have a lot of money, they are also supported by the state, and somehow all this network on independent organizations actually goes into that direction to the voices of these who are more managerial, to say, and more they earn more money because they are more connected with the parties or with the private sector. They are actually stronger as a voices. So this organization, Jadro, is considered as a public civil partnerships. So this is one model that is promoted very much on the region, and it is usually considered as actually public-private partnerships, because this word civic is becoming very unclear and untransparent. What does it mean, civic? And is there something that is cohesive to the society? Because in socialism, there we have a notion that is called social property. It means that actually it was a kind of cohesive power of the collective, being part of something that exists for all of us, actually. But in capitalism, there was no such a cohesive elements, and even if starting to be organizing, this kind of group initiative that are claiming that are civic and more general for everyone and so on, they are actually in a practice very much based on private interest. So this civic is a really unclear what does it mean actually, and usually it's private public. And actually I think this is the one of the definitely characteristic of these processes. And okay. Okay, but at the same moment, while this institution, this organization of the independent scene were organizing, the state was also changing itself. And after some time, the change actually, state made an effort to meet this independent organization, especially taking on itself the characteristic of elite and representative of private capital. So actually, state were becoming much more open and neoliberal, and including in itself all these private influences. So actually the change was, the state was changing and the independent sector was somehow changing, and at some moment they meet each other and become actually one in Jadro as a kind of private-public partnerships. So that means that actually city gave the space and gave the salaries of the people who work in the independent cultural sector. And actually by doing that, these independents start to operate in this delicate domain of deculturalization or pre-culturalization by the state. And these processes that were supposed to enable all participants for work and exploitation in this sense, the art, market, and creative industry, were increasingly conducted by the state itself. Because state was the one that was rapidly changing and putting actually on itself the role of the one who will actually change the society on this way to organize as a system of private-public partnerships and so on. And we could say also that Jadro was somehow initiated also by the city, because the first call to organize in the independent scene was coming from the city of Skopje, who called independent organization to somehow organize. And if we look through the institutions here, we will see that a lot of the state is leader of these processes of transformation, the institutions very much, because, for example, the state is putting the managers on the main positions in institutions to reform the institution on this way to make institution exist as a private-public partnerships, or to just be very much commercial. So the public institutions start to rent the spaces, to use all the resources to earn the money to be self-sustainable, actually. And the people who actually work into that system, they are the most wanted managers which are desired by the system. And for example, the one that are existing as creative entrepreneurships and so on, who start organizing the spaces that are earning a lot of money, are actually invited by the state to, and for them, the positions in the state institutions were offered to organize. For example, we had a Minister of Culture in Serbia till a few years, who were firstly director of the Philharmony, and he succeeded to organize the Philharmony in the way to earn a lot of money. Whole orchestra he was renting to the TV shows, organizing commercial concerts and so on. So actually he succeeded to ask the government for less money and to earn the money as an institution, and he later became a Ministry of Culture. So he was offered the the possibility was given to him to change all the system of culture into that way. And this is really some tendency that is very strong now, and this is something that is also detectable here in Macedonia and on a very high way. And what is here kind of problematic, and I would also like to say, is that we usually consider state as a public. What is really problematic in a sense, because after some time, state actually become the guard of the private, actually not of the public. And by fighting for this kind of interfering with the state, we are really close to enter into that trap, to enter in all these state structures that will lead us into this neoliberal system of culture and so on, not actually the social. And and after the fall of socialism, the intensive transformation of social ownership into the state started, and the process of privatization of state property under the patronage of the ruling parties by creating a network of private-public partnerships. The state has been increasingly becoming private, while it was still considered as public. For this and for many other reasons, it became difficult here to make distinction between the state and the society. The social, following the fate of social property, become pretty shapeless, erratic, and difficult to catch. So we actually don't have a society. By entering in the umbrella of state, all this civil initiative, cultural initiative, and so on, we don't have any more organization that will really deal with the society. What is society, and can we at all talk about society anymore, or we have only private interest and we have a state interest? And now I will a little bit cut because I see I'm out of time. Two offers for the institutions, two possibilities for the institutions are offered, or to be creative entrepreneurs, to earn the money, to make a business, creative industry, so on, or to be state institution. There is no actually the next one. And what is really important, all these procedures are really supported through these, how to say, above national structures of EU that are very much financing all these structures, also foreign embassies and so on, all this transformation to go into that way. And actually, when we are saying about state, I don't mean only national state, that is almost doesn't exist anymore, because our states in the Balkan become kind of NGOs that are financed by IMF on all these structures, and there is no independence even of the state, but they are more dependent of these above national structures. And this is a whole huge domain that is really problematic, and the influence of these domains here in Macedonia are very strong, especially today when we are living in such a period of strong globalization that are changing. And what I would like now to a little bit to switch on the this doesn't work actually. Oh, okay, okay. I would like to show one cultural center, what is really important. And I think this is something that should exist more as a kind of reminder to all of us what can happen if we only stay under the state. There is a house of culture in Ilinden. What is this? This house of culture was formed in the 50s and had a really long history that I mentioned yesterday a little bit, but in some moment it was totally abandoned and the government of that village decided to totally destroy that and to build totally new cultural center. And this cultural center was looking like a space shuttle in this small village that has only like a 4,500 people, villagers, and more of the people are working into the economic zone. You see, there is several economic zones, the gray zone. This is economic zone where a lot of foreign corporations are operating, like Johnson & Johnson and so on, chemical industry, refinery, and so on. And here, the cultural center is really totally bizarre. Like, it is totally empty. People are actually not coming there. And they have a huge gallery, huge conference hall. I mean, it is and there is also room for translation and so on. And I asked who is coming here. They said the corporations. I mean, it is actually a house of culture that is totally financed by public money and everything, but actually in the practice is totally used for a dominant economical purpose that state is actually controlling. And it is totally, and I think this is really something that is the future actually of our institutions if we don't change something structurally. And but actually it's not future, it's today. And it is really huge. There is a bar that is used when some businesses are going on, investors are coming, they have a meeting there, and a lot of programs are going on there, but all the programs is totally separated from the people. People almost do not come there. And they have a huge hall. I mean, this is village. This is totally, I mean, doesn't fit into that space. They have a very small library, and the lady that is working there told me that there is only 7 people who are visiting the library. And also in the first hall, there is a huge gallery with the walls that are moving, like for really kind of contemporary exhibitions. And also there are industrial map in the gallery and these kind of images. So actually this was my presentation. It should be a much longer, but I see we are just out of time, and actually I'm not that happy how I started, but I will stop here. Okay, there is some question or something.
It's dark.
I'm not sure, in the introduction you said that after that Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, during the, I don't know, second half of the 70s, you mentioned free market.
Yes,
Is that,
yes.
I'm not, I'm not exactly sure whether we can really speak about free market at the time. I think the market had a certain kind of elements of circulation of goods, promotion of goods, advertising, but basically all the factories or all the economic companies were somehow regulated by the local authorities or state authorities. And there is, I think, concerning self-management at the time, because it was, I'm not, I'm not completely sure what was, because the new legislation on the self-management was introduced in 75 after the Constitution 74 was kind of accepted, confirmed, I don't know what is the term. and at the time, at the time, in this second half of the 70s, the new kind of concept of self-management was for the first time extensively introduced also in the cultural institutions. And the cultural institutions, as far as I know, kind of fell into some kind of desperate disintegration of organization. It was impossible to keep, for example, I know from the theater companies that... Kako? Aha, da. What I know from the Slovenian situation at the time is that basically it was hard to keep actors in the houses because this self-management was understood also as some kind of self-organization. So basically actors would have salaries in the houses, but they would be around shooting films, working on television and so on. This was one thing. The other thing is that the self-management councils were responsible for confirming repertoires in the theater. So you had the situation that basically the cleaning person at the one period at the end of 70s was basically refused the seasonal repertoire because she claimed that the repertoire is ideologically problematic. So basically, yeah. I mean, you had a kind of, you had a total disintegration of the system at the time. But this self-management in cultural institutions, which were 100% subsidized and had very little profits, is something completely different that the self-management in the companies, which had the workers there had a right to basically claim what they will do with the 70% of the profits that they would make. Yeah, and because you mentioned this kind of taxi drivers, I'm not sure if taxi services were private. I don't think so. So I don't know. Cooperatives, zadruge. I mean, what I want to stress out that basically this period from the, let's say, economic reforms in 65 on, it's really full of contradictions. And yeah, and we have to be very precise what we claim from the nowadays kind of perspectives. I think in terms of cultural institutions, basically I don't know any study which would kind of focus on this period, and all those ridiculous stories would be very, very kind of, it would be good to collect them at a certain point, also to understand why NGO sector is getting formed at the time. So just this.
Okay, I'm sorry if I was not, how to say that, clear enough, and also I try to be very short, and of course it is very controversial, and I was trying to show actually exactly that we couldn't say that the cultural institutions at that time were totally dependent nor totally independent. This was my kind of focus, and I absolutely realized that it was like that, you know, as you say. But of course, it is controlled by the state, and I said that the cultural system. Yeah, but at that time we could talking about state party, actually, not only about state, nor only about party. It was one.
federal legislation, and exactly this in the 1980s became so complicated that it was this kind of bureaucratic system couldn't kind of sustain its or yeah.
Yeah, it was a kind of social welfare system, let's say like that. But actually, Yugoslavian socialism really opened itself toward the market economy since 60s. Now I can't, to be honest, remember with what kind of constitution or congress or something like this, but I was part of this, some kind of workshops that were reading these processes, how actually the entering in the market system was organized. But actually the economy was working on that way. Like you had in one, I don't know, in Macedonia, we're producing one product, and I don't know, in Slovenia, another one, and they were kind of fighting. And the prices were formed in, for example, if there is two products, according to some kind of market mechanism. It was a kind of market, you know, and some areas were organized through the market, of course, most of other are not.
In terms of, in terms of analysis of economy, there is this very, very, very good book of Patrick Hyder Patterson, Bought and Sold, Living and Losing the Good Life in Socialist Yugoslavia, which is kind of, it goes through, with a lot of data, goes through these changes in an economy, which are very kind of, he calls it kind of consumeristic socialism, exceptional socialism, and of course there were elements of the free market, but not really, and this became problem in the 1980s because because of the financial crisis in the 1970s in the international market, because of energetic crisis with the oil in the 70s and so on, and also because Yugoslavia took some loans in the Wall Street, and after these Volcker shocks in 78, it was impossible to pay them back.
I think, Danilo, you took such a heavy, huge task, which is problematic to be realized not because of you, but because of us who didn't make preliminary research that would feed you global research. My suggestion generally would be for you, and that you will see how all of your thesis about free market, etc., is going to fall down, to focus only on visual arts. The research of Trivo Indjic in 80s in Yugoslavia has shown, and he explicitly said that in this published book, that the precarity of visual artists in socialist Yugoslavia was huge. So we very often take examples of theaters, and those what you are telling, but theaters have been, I mean, taking the numbers of the people employed in and so on, it was really not relevant in a sense. Yes, they misused the self-governance, was not following accountability or, how can I say, responsibility. It was massively misused, and it's still misused as a tradition in Serbia, not everywhere, not in Slovenia, for example, but in Serbia. A right to refuse the role in a theater is endless. So there are actors who for 5 years refused, not that they haven't been offered, they refused. Why should I act? I don't care, I'm going to do a movie and have a salary. But I think the more important thing is not to go in a trap that self-government was something which existed as it was written. So I participated, I lived this period. I know, even without being a member of the party, so not having this kind of political credibility in collective, if I really would like something, I'm a talkative person, I could persuade not only cleaning ladies, but also the other colleagues and professors. And yes, that was the truth. Everyone was, for example, where to spend our extra income. on salaries. Cleaning lady would vote for the salary. Professors of drama art would vote for making the theater hall. And we, young assistants, we stood up and we voted for social housing, for the apartments. We say we don't know, we don't have where to live. So you had different interest. You can say now it was a market interest, yeah, because somebody needed money, somebody needed resource for work, because professors of film directing, they have extra honorarium. For them, salary of university was insignificant, and so on. So yes, if you compare film business in Yugoslavia, that was the film business, and that was a market. If you compare, I know that none of us knew to respond on the question in 1973 when I entered university, which was the most, box office money best movie. And then, because we are in Skopje, I'm going to tell it now, we start saying like different Rubljov, this, that, all what we know that was the best in last year. Professor laughed and said some title. And then none of us knew for the title. Macedonia film imported, it was a Bollywood movie. Even today, nobody knows that in Yugoslavia, socialist, the most earning film on the box office, because we neglected those data. We had those data, what we prized and so on. So it's so complex. My suggestion would be that you focus on visual arts, that you really see what was the market which started to appear. First galleries, Us Gallery and others in Belgrade, and how this market collapsed, why, and so on. So it is interesting to know.
Yeah, actually I was a little bit start researching these things because my focus came actually from the present, from the situation that we have now, these relations that are going on at the moment. But actually I start researching because there was no anything written in the field of visual art. I start talking with the people in Belgrade I've seen about this scene. And actually what I realized from that talk, this is also something that is part of the talks. And all the things that I was saying here, it's not kind of facts, because it is actually, my story is based on the talks with the people, and this is the only one research that I was using. They told me, for example, that Student Cultural Center in Belgrade was actually as a kind of hub that was actually sending the artists on the Western art market from the 70s and so on. For example, for some artists, there was a situation that the whole industry was actually engaged to build a huge, like a megalomaniac sculptures that were then exported on the West and so on. So Yugoslavia was also in the field of visual art starting, in a sense, to enter in this kind of, this kind of economical logic that actually other countries still today, have. But actually it was partly organized, it was, maybe we could say it was organized totally by the state, and also we can say this is totally part of this world tendency of that time, that Yugoslavia was struggling on the global markets for its own. Okay, sorry. But of course, I absolutely agree that this is something that I really need to more enter in. Thank you.